In this video, we will be changing the transmission fluid out in this 2008 Hyundai Elantra. The vehicle has almost 30,000 miles on it. Conventional transmission fluid only lasts usually a maximum of 30,000 miles, so it's probably about time to flush the system out. As we take a look at the transmission fluid, it's evident that it's no longer red. This is kind of a brownish color, which definitely means that it's at the end of its life. Now, for the purpose of this demonstration, so we can see things a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and remove this piece. From a little bit different angle, this is the piece that we're removing, and we are going to want to look down in this area. Now, what we're looking for is the oil cooler hoses, which are about this size. If we look down into the engine, we can see that there's two lines here. And if we follow those lines, each one of them should run into the oil cooler. And you can see right there, that hose says oil. The oil cooler is located on the end of our radiator. And if we follow those lines, one of them goes into the top and one of them goes into the bottom. Now, what I've done is disconnect both of the oil lines because we need to figure out which oil line is the supply line. And what I'm going to do is start the car for about 2 seconds and turn it off, and whichever one of these tubes has transmission oil flowing through it, that is going to be our supply line. Now that I've identified and labeled my supply line, I went ahead and put my hoses back on, and I'm going to put the rest of the pieces back together. The two primary products that we're going to be using is AMSOIL's engine and transmission flush and AMSOIL's synthetic automatic transmission fluid. You will need to remove the transmission fluid dipstick and use a funnel with a real small end. And then we're going to add the entire contents of the engine and transmission flush to our transmission. The purpose of AMSOIL's transmission flush is to clean off all of the components in the transmission and in the oil cooler, and this is going to help it function better. And go ahead and replace the dipstick. You will want to engage the emergency brake and then start the vehicle. You'll want to idle the vehicle for 10 to 15 minutes and make sure you shift through drive and reverse. Shifting through all the gears will ensure that the AMSOIL transmission flush is able to reach all of the nooks and crannies inside the transmission and torque converter. After we've idled the vehicle for about 15 minutes, we need to drain the transmission fluid from the pan. To get a little bit better access to the transmission pan, I removed the shroud that was covering up half of it. I went ahead and loosened my bolt, and I'm going to go ahead and take it the rest of the way out. It is recommended that you wear gloves because the transmission fluid will be hot. Additionally, you always want to make sure that you have safety glasses on. Now, this is not going to drain the entire transmission and torque converter. It will only drain what's sitting in the bottom of the pan. For this repair, we're actually going to have to remove the transmission pan and clean the gasket off. When you use the AMSOIL engine flush, you need to make sure that you replace the filter as well. While that's finishing draining, I'm going to go around and loosen the transmission pan bolts. And I'm actually going to loosen these in sequence. So I'm not going to go around in a circle, but I'm going to loosen them across from each other. And that's just a good practice to do, just to make sure that you are evenly reducing the pressure on the pan. Now, out of curiosity, I wanted to see how much fluid I actually drained just by removing the plug. And granted, there is a little bit of oil mixed in with that just because I had used a pan that I had previously used for doing an oil change. So we have here just over a half a gallon of fluid. Now that the fluid is drained and our plug is back in, I'm going to go ahead and remove all of those bolts that's holding the pan on. Now, because the manufacturer uses a silicone type gasket maker, it's a little bit difficult to remove the pan, but once you get it started, then you can see the whole pan just comes pretty easily. You just want to make sure you're real careful not to damage any of the mating surfaces. And once we have this loose, then we can peel away the rest of it with our hands, but be careful because there will still be some fluid inside of it. And now that we have this loose, we can pretty much just peel it away with it. So at this point, we've drained all of the fluid out from underneath the vehicle that sits in the pan. The next thing I did is I disconnected that supply line again to the oil cooler. And I'm going to be squirting a little bit of compressed air through there. I don't want to blast it out, but what I want to do is clear the oil cooler of any transmission fluid. And this will push that fluid out onto the ground. Now, inside of the transmission case here, we have our filter, and that we have to replace. In preparation for this demonstration, I actually contacted the dealership to ask what the torque specs were for the transmission pan bolts. Now, the mechanic I talked to said that Hyundai never changes the transmission filter. Instead, they back flush the system or do a reverse flush. And I did a little research on that, and basically what they do is they take high pressured transmission fluid and blow it back or reverse through the system, and it cleans the filter that way. And what I've read online is basically it takes everything the filter's caught and it blows all that junk back through the transmission. And there's actually been some people who've said they've had transmission problems after doing this. And more fluid. Out of curiosity's sake, I wanted to compare my old transmission filter with my new transmission filter. Specifically, I want to look inside at the filter element in there. Obviously, one's clean, one's dirty. Next, we need to install the new transmission pan filter. And tighten those down snug. Now, the pieces we've taken off are the transmission pan and the transmission filter, which we've already replaced. We're going to address the filter right now. If you flip the filter over on the back, you'll notice that there's two magnets, and the magnets have a lot of nasty residue on that. Those magnets collect any metallic particles that are in the transmission. What we're going to do is remove those magnets, and we need to clean them. So I'm just going to take a rag here, and I'm going to wipe the magnets until they look nice and clean. And then we're going to reinstall the magnets on our new filter. After that, we need to clean the mating surfaces on the pan, so that means we're going to scrape off any gasket material. And on the pan itself, we need to scrape off the gasket material, but we want to be real careful we don't gouge any of the metal, otherwise it has trouble sealing. Now, we have a couple items to remove the gasket. We have a gasket remover, and then we also have a gasket scraper. I'm hoping since the vehicle is not very old, I can just get by with the gasket scraper and not have to worry about using a chemical on it. To create the gasket, I'm going to be using Permatex Automatic Transmission RTV Sealant, and that's going to make my gasket. I'm going to go around the entire pan and around each bolt hole, so there's a consistent bead all around it. And then we're going to reinstall the pan immediately. To find the torque specs for the transmission pan bolts, I contacted the manufacturer of the actual transmission filter, and they were more than happy to provide me with that information. Now, the manufacturer of the gasket material recommends just hand tightening them until the gasket material starts to ooze out. Once all of our bolts are finger tight, we will let the gasket material cure for about 1 to 2 hours, and then we'll go back and torque all of our bolts. Now that we've let our gasket maker sit for about 1 to 2 hours, we're going to come back and torque each bolt with a torque wrench, and we're going to be going to about 90 inch-pounds. And we want to make sure that we tighten the bolts in sequence, meaning we're not going to go around in a circle. We're going to move across from the previous bolt that we tightened, and we're going to continue to go across till all the bolts are tightened. And don't forget to double check that your transmission plug is tight. Now, with the additional transmission fluid that came out when we took the pan off and when we took the filter out, that raises our level to right about 3/4 of a gallon or 3 quarts. Now, according to AMSOIL's website, this particular vehicle holds about 7 quarts of fluid, so we still have quite a bit more we need to get out, and this is found in the torque converter. To get the rest of the fluid out, we're going to take a length of oil cooler hose, and we're going to be connecting that hose to our supply line that we found earlier. Now, what I've done is I've connected my oil cooler hose to my supply port, and I have that running into my collection bin, which I've put a white piece of paper on the back so we can see the color of the fluid coming out. The next step we need to do is add about 3 quarts of transmission fluid in to replace what we took out. And again, for this, we are using AMSOIL's automatic transmission fluid, which is fully synthetic. In addition to outperforming conventional ATF fluid, AMSOIL's fluid is rated for 50,000 miles in severe service or 100,000 miles in normal service. Now, as you start your vehicle, it's critical that you continue to add transmission fluid. You never want the transmission to run out of fluid because it could destroy the transmission. So right now, as the fluid is being flushed through the torque converter, I'm continuing to add quarts of transmission fluid to fill the space that I'm emptying out. If you take a look, you can see that the fluid is slowly turning from a dark brown to a nice bright red. Ideally, you want to flush all of the fluid out of the torque converter, and there will be a little bit of waste, but you'll make sure that you know that all the fluid is nice and clean at the end. In total, we flushed about 8.5 to 9 quarts of transmission fluid out of the system. Some of this ended up on the ground, so we might even be up a little bit higher than that. The last few things you want to do is double check the level of your transmission fluid to make sure that it's topped off, and clean off your engine anywhere that transmission fluid might have spilled on it. And if you took any pieces off, go ahead and put those back on also.